We continued over the weekend to see all sorts of amazing violent protests committed in the cities around America, all supposedly stemming from the violence, one particular action, a Minneapolis police officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd. That supposedly prompted all of the protests we've seen around the country. And part of the response from left-wing governments around this country is growing talk about the idea, should we defund the police departments? Actually, that's a serious question they're asking. Should we, in response to criminal rampages, defund the police department? I'm going to ask Matt the Wonderful to show you a very short clip. This is just a clip someone took in Minneapolis after the rampaging mobs came through downtown Minneapolis and destroyed buildings, burned buildings. Take a look. So that is downtown Minneapolis. I will tell you, if you listen to my show very often, you realize that I've mentioned before, my dad grew up in Minneapolis, in Minnetonka, and I have a wide range of cousins, both sides of my family, all over Minnesota. I was texting with one of them over the weekend, and he said, he lives outside of Minneapolis in a suburb, but he said downtown Minneapolis looks kind of like Libya in the day, referring to the fact it looks like a war zone. So in response to that level of violence, criminal conduct, police largely being held back, not because they don't understand what to do, but because they're following orders to more or less let these people rampage. So I want to tell you the most amazing interview that happened. So in Minneapolis, after what you just saw, that kind of violence, the city council has voted. They have now voted to essentially defund the Minneapolis Police Department. Defund the police department. They're going to switch over to something like kind of a community justice based idea instead of actually using police. Quick clip Matt the Wonderful has of Ilhan Omar explaining this to a cheering crowd in Minneapolis.
Saying not only do we need to disinvest in police, but we need to completely dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department.
Okay, she's talking about dismantling the police department. That cheering went on and on and on. I spared you listening to it, but on and on and on. So you have Ilhan Omar, Democrat socialist, Muslim activist, member of Congress, urging people in Minneapolis to get behind this idea. Even more amazingly, a member of the city council, in Minneapolis, someone who's elected by the people of Minneapolis after they voted. And by the way, the Minneapolis mayor first said, no, we can't defund the police department. Mob turned on him, screaming at him. But a member of the Minneapolis Police Department went on CNN with Allison Camerata. So she's basically saying, yeah, it's a beautiful thing. We've defunded the police department. Defunded. We're going to turn to a more community-based justice. So Allison Camerata asked a question which would be on the minds of millions of Americans. Well, what if someone's breaking into my house? So what do I do if I can hear someone breaking into my house at night, stealing things from me? To which this woman answered, the Minneapolis City Council, the president of the Minneapolis City Council named Lisa Bender said, yes, I mean, and I hear that loud and clear from several of my neighbors, and I know, and myself too, and I know that comes from a place of privilege. So now you're exhibiting, apparently, the unspoken word white, exhibiting white privilege if you think, because you pay your taxes, that if your house is being robbed, you ought to be able to call the police and someone will show up. That is in the mindset of now the radical socialist American left that runs Minneapolis. That is now their mindset, explaining why if you happen to be a taxpayer who owns a home or an apartment in Minneapolis and you you can hear a criminal getting into your apartment, already in your apartment, that you're exhibiting white privilege if you want to complain about it. You're exhibiting privilege if you think that you should be able to call the police for whom you've been paying taxes for years and that they ought to come and protect you and your property. I will tell you, folks, Minneapolis isn't the only one. Chicago also talking about defunding the police. And in Chicago, they had, over this past weekend, they had the most murders in Chicago, 18 murders in 24 hours. the deadliest day in Chicago in 60 years. This is since the riots. So you had the massive, and they're not protests. These are not George Floyd protests. These are Antifa, Black Lives Matter, radical left socialist protests, socialist rioters and looters in Chicago, leading to crime and death and murder in Chicago after a weekend with 18 murders in 24 hours, breaking a record of 60 years, 6-0. The answer of the city council is, we're thinking about defunding the police. I mean, they seem so annoying. Why do we have to have police? Other cities also talking about that, even though, by the way, and wrapping up the first five, I'll point out, even though in these cities you had, in the course of all this violence, and again, there aren't protesters who are protesting anything about George Floyd. These are simply criminal, thug, left-wing, socialist, Marxist elements in this country, funded, motivated, encouraged by Antifa and Black Lives Matter. You had 15 people. 15 people died in the protests and riots following George Floyd's death. I could spend some time going through each of them, but understand, 15 people who had nothing to do with George Floyd's death. Also killed in light of all of these looters and arsonists and murderers who took to the streets of America after the George Floyd situation. So a lot of cities are doing this. In fact, New York City, one last thing in the first five today, New York City is now shifting funding from the police department to youth and social services. People, these kids, these adults, these looters, arsonists, robbers, thieves, and murderers were not on the streets of New York City and all the cities around this country because we lack sufficient social services. That's not the reason they were there. They were there because the American left has been taken over by a radical Marxist element that encourages their conduct, encourages and funds Antifa, encourages and funds Black Lives Matter, and that's where we are today. That's where we are today. We are dealing with those people committing mayhem around our country, and it is not the answer to provide more free stuff and free social services for more kids in New York City or anyplace else. Eric Holder, as you likely recall, Eric Holder, he was the Attorney General under President Obama, looks at all of this massive violence, and instead of saying, wow, let's step up and solve this and bring law and order to our cities, and at the same time bring correction to police departments around the country as needed, he sees it as, this is our moment to make sweeping changes in America. Folks, the sweeping changes the left wants will endanger America, city to city, state to state, around this country. The kind of changes they would bring are a danger to America and to the whole concept of law and order in this country. And that, my very fine friends, is today's First Five.